we're going to make a big step forward. We're going to start chapter 2 of the first section of St. Teresa's Interior Castles. This is about our third session, or was it our fourth session? Sister D, are we up to number 3 or number 4?
We are up to number 3.
Number 3. Oh, good, then I don't feel so bad. It hasn't taken.
Yes, Bishop.
Okay, there's Father Joy, and I can't see him. I like to see Father Joy. He's my brother, even though we don't look alike at all. There's Father Joy. Okay, we're going to start to move through into chapter 2 of the first book of the Interior Castles. Does anyone want to have a go at saying what we've done in the last 2 talks? It's very important that after I give a talk on something like St. Teresa and her spirituality, you need to be able to get up and go for a walk and talk to yourself about what I said. Because if you can do that, you've learnt something. That was my method from when I was in high school. Doesn't matter what I was studying. When I walked along, I would try to say to myself what I'd learned. And that meant that whenever I did an exam, it was always there. If you can say it, it'll go into your head and it will always be there. If you can't say what you've learned, you haven't learnt it. Okay, and what I'm doing each time is simple things. And I want you to go away, and if you can't go for a walk and talk to yourself, because to do that you have to be mad like your bishop. People who talk to themselves are meant to be mad. Talk to each other and simply talk to the other one as if you're telling them what you learned. And if you do that enough times back and forth, you'll suddenly find you're learning a lot. Okay? Because I'm doing this so that you'll learn. So does anyone want to have a go at saying what we've done so far? I don't expect rocket science because I've been reading St. Teresa since about 1984, 83. Okay, and none of you were you born in 83, Sister Evelyn? Were you born in 1983?
Yeah, I was born in 1976.
Oh, good. So you were alive. You could have been reading it too. So anyone just want to have a go? Anyone from anywhere? And if no one can, we'll choose the person who's furthest away. Who attending is furthest away? Or Sister D. Okay, so come on. Have a go, yeah.
So right at the start, Teresa of Ávila is setting the scene to try and explain, I guess, speaking from her experience of God, how she would like to describe the human soul. So the first part of chapter 1 is setting that scene as this is a castle and we're going to start on the outside, and right at the centre is God. So we're going to work our way in. And then last time we focused more on that first step coming from outside, stepping into that first room. And we also focused a bit on what prayer actually is and the importance of knowing who we're talking to in God, who we are as individuals, and what we're asking Him or saying to Him. And then I think the importance as well of attempting to, like that first step is really attempting to make our desire for God that's what is going to rule our life. That's kind of that first step, is the desire, wanting to know God. And that's more or less.
Oh, I wish I wasn't a bishop, because if I wasn't, I'd get up and give you a big hug. I don't think Sister Evelyn, Sister D, or Father Joy could have given a better answer. Very good. Okay, so all St. Teresa's doing is talking about her experience, and like Jesus, we get it all the time. How can I talk about God? And the funny thing is, he never does. He gives parables. It's a funny thing. He doesn't give theology. Beware of the man or the woman who talks about God with theology. So chances are they've never met God. And Jesus can't tell us who's God, what is God. So it's a bit like this. It's like a person sowing seed. Or it's like a person who opens his cupboard and finds things new and old. It's like a lady making bread who puts yeast in. And of course, a lady making bread throwing yeast in us, that's not God. But for Jesus, I can't find the words to tell you who God is. But if I give you these images in time, if you look at them again and again and again, you'll suddenly realize what he's trying to teach us. Okay, that's a powerful thing. And that's the genius of Jesus's teaching. Saint Teresa is doing the same thing. I've experienced God. That's Jesus's. No one knows the Father except the Son who has come from the Father. Okay. Saint Teresa saying, I've experienced God like Jesus has experienced the Father, but how am I going to tell you? Okay. A theology won't tell you anything because you're talking about an experience. Tell me, John, what a pizza tastes like.
Bishop, I can probably only tell you about my experience of what pizza tastes like.
Okay, well, tell me.
It tastes like pineapple and ham and cheese.
Okay, well, what does pineapple, ham, and cheese taste like? Let's say I'm from Mars and I don't understand what you're talking about.
I don't know, Bishop.
You see, if I haven't had that experience, you can't even tell me what a pizza tastes like. Can you? And if you told an Italian, it tastes like ham and pineapple, he'll say, there's no ham or pineapple on a pizza. And he'll think, are you mad or something? What have you been eating? Okay, so it comes down to the inability to express a human experience. And Saint Teresa, like, what are you eating down there? Who are those people eating? You're like Filipinos. Every time I've given talks in the Philippines, they're always eating chips and peanuts while I'm giving the talk. Are you Filipinos? As Sister D told you what to do when the bishop's giving a talk. Eat snacks.
Sorry, we're eating dinner. We're having hot chips.
Yeah, I'm
And-
sorry too, I've got nothing.
Oh. I don't know what to say.
So that's the problem, isn't it? That's a problem with what Saint Teresa's doing. And as you correctly said, she says, all I can think of is the soul which experiences God is like the most beautiful mansion or building made up of diamond, because that's who you are. She can't think of anything more valuable than a diamond. And she says, that's what every human being is valuable as a diamond. But this is even more wonderful, because in the middle of this diamond is God, okay? And God's light flows out of the diamond. And if you meet a holy person, you will meet God coming out of that person. That leads me to where I want to begin tonight. Because in order to understand who you are and what this diamond is, and the wonderful thing about God dwelling within you, she says, I'm going to have to talk to you about sin. Okay? and she says, we have to think about what sin is. I've just done 2 lots of confirmations, yesterday and on Monday. I said to the kids, one of the first things God wants you to know is what's right and wrong. And I said, I wonder why he wants you to know what's wrong. They're all scratching their heads. Yeah, why does God want me to know what's wrong? And eventually one kid put up her hand and said, because God doesn't want me to do it. I said, that's right. That's why God wants you to know what's wrong. And so for the Carmelite, as we're going to look at it, sin must have a positive place in our lives. Otherwise, there's something greater than God. You know, any group that's teaching you beware of sin and all this, and they stop there. They're basically saying there's something that you're experiencing which can't bring you to God. And that means if the devil's the cause of it, the devil's greater than God. That's the most stupid thing anyone could say. But it's being said by Catholics and Christians all over the world. It's been said by them way back to the time of St. Augustine. And St. Augustine argued against that position. But still people keep falling into it. Because if I talk to you about sin as if sin is so powerful, I've got control of you. I will use sin to take control of your mind and the way you think and do things. And that's certainly not the way the Carmelites think. Okay? Because otherwise, we would be proposing a power which could be greater than God. And that ignores the fact that Jesus came into the world and died for us to overcome sin. And it basically means he came and did all of this and it was a waste of time. Okay? And to say it was a waste of time is a heresy, number one. But if it is a waste of time, it makes you wonder who and what God is. Okay? So now we're going to look and see what St. Teresa says about sin. She says in the 2nd paragraph of chapter 2, I know a person to whom our Lord wanted to show what a soul in mortal sin was like. Who's she talking about? She's talking about herself. But she doesn't want to brag and say, our Lord told me what it's like. But listen to what she's saying. And you go home and read the 1st and 2nd paragraphs because we have to move on. We talk about sin in relation to that beautiful image that St. Teresa gave us of who you are. You're the most beautiful thing in the world, a diamond. And so in her vision of what sin is, what is sin? It's like tar all around the diamond. And in terms of her image of the soul, it means no light can come out of it. But she says, that's not the problem, because God is still in the center of the soul that's in mortal sin. It's an extraordinary thing she says. God is there. And the light doesn't come out. So the first thing she's saying about sin is not what so many other people teach. You're in sin, you're going to go to hell. She doesn't talk like that, because that's not the point of it. The thing about sin is what it does to you. Your beauty is now totally obliterated by this darkness, and what it says to God. And that goes back to her first statement about prayer at the end of chapter 1, where she says, I don't call it prayer if you don't know who you are. And we'll come back to that in a minute, or maybe next month. If you don't know who you are, who's talking. You don't know who God is that you're talking to, and you don't know what you're saying. You know, I emphasized that last time because it means prayer must be more than words you say. Whatever words you say, you probably don't know what you're saying. That's the problem with people, and we got it in chapter 6 of the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 6, around verse 6 and following, where he says, when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites who think that by saying many words they will be heard. Because the words without meaning are not your words, they're somebody else's. And it means that when you turn to God, you're not turning to God as you are, but trying to be somebody else. And obviously, God's not going to be very impressed. So as we will move on further, prayer is not about words. But prayer is about, as we're told again in St. Matthew's Gospel, the Beatitudes, blessed are the pure in heart, because they will see God. Without that purity of heart, which means a heart without sin, you won't be able to see God. Okay? So the implications of sin are not, you will go to hell. I mean, that's God's decision where I go. The implication of sin is, it is destructive of who you are. It's an insult to the God who is within you and will ensure that you will not see God. That's, in fact, more powerful than if you do a mortal sin, you're going to go to hell. Well, consignment to hell is God's decision. And we will later on look theologically at what a mortal sin is, because it's actually quite hard to commit one. Because it entails the total free rejection of God. Okay? And for the life of me, I don't think I could totally and freely reject God. So it's not as easy as, oh my God, I forgot to do that, I've done a mortal sin. That is something which the church has moved away from, which is that, you know, a silly decision on my part can put me into hell. No, because my path is always working with God. Okay, so she begins by saying what sin is. It blocks out the light. I'll read what she says. Yet it is as capable, the soul, of enjoying the majesty of God as the crystal is capable of reflecting the sun's brilliance. And when she talks about mortal sin, let's find what she says. Since, after all, the intention of anyone who commits a mortal sin is to please the devil, who is darkness itself, not God, the poor soul becomes darkness itself. So the Lord gave me, strong desire that all might understand this. May he give you the desire to beseech God earnestly for those who are in this state, who have not become total darkness, and whose works have become darkness also. For just as all the streams that flow from a crystal clear fount are also clear, the works of a soul in grace, because they proceed from the fount of life. Notice what she's saying here. Good works are not works done because your good works, as the opposite picture from what sin is, are works that come from God who's within. That's an extraordinary statement. And she is the first woman to be made a doctor of the church. Any good that you can do with this understanding of sin is God working from you. And so your good work is God being made present. And your sin is blocking the God within you from coming out and doing things. Do you see what she's saying? And which is why the focus on hell, in fact, misses the whole point of it. And it doesn't give you freedom in relation to sin and what to do, nor does it show you what goodness is. It should be kept in mind here that the fount of life, which is the same fountain that Jesus talks about with the woman at the well in St. John's Gospel, it should be kept in mind here that the fount, the shining sun at the center of the soul, does not lose its beauty and splendor. It is always present in the soul, and nothing can take away its loveliness. But if a black cloth is placed over the crystal, obviously the sun's brilliance will have no effect and cannot shine through it. So, as she begins to talk about sin, at this point we need to move on. But the important thing is, without discussing what sin is, we will not know how to move towards God. Okay? And in the end, not sinning is not good enough. Okay? Because from what she's given us, in fact, the only way forward is to allow God to work through us. And not sinning does not mean that you're good. Not sinning does not mean that you're loving, does it? And so there's a whole other area which needs to be emphasized and talked about, and that'll come up further down. Okay, so it's why she needs to talk about sin, but she will move from here because the focus can't be sin. Because if the focus is sin and fear of hell, the focus is not God. Okay, so it needs to move. And at this point, we'll start to move because I could continue to talk about that, but it's almost 6 o'clock and I need to, I know kind of what I want to do, so I'm going to try to do what I want to do. Otherwise, I get stuck. The next question which should arise is, why do I sin? Okay, it's all very well to talk about sin and the effect of sin and what that means. But the practical question that you need to ask is, why do I sin? Okay, to simply say, I sin and I go to confession, blah, 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 without asking yourself the question, why, you're never going to make a step in any direction. Okay, all I can say about you is you recognize you're doing something wrong, but you don't know why. And this question has to be asked within the context of her image of the soul as a mansion. Because as she said quite correctly, what we are meant to do is to enter this mansion and walk through it until we come to the point where God is. Very powerful thing. Yeah, God is outside me, but God's in me. And the God that's outside me pales into insignificance compared to the God that is within me. You might ask, well, what about Holy Communion? You receive Holy Communion so that it can go within you, don't you? That's the whole point of it. And again, there you need to have simplicity. It's not about how you receive it, what you do. It's about having a heart and a soul prepared to receive the Eucharist so that you can receive the Eucharist deeper and deeper within your soul. Okay? And that's not something addressed by externalities. It's addressed by moving towards purity of heart. That kind of receipt of the Eucharist is a receipt of the Eucharist which happens because you get rid of those things within you that inhibit your receiving the Eucharist very deeply within yourself. And so many people do all sorts of things. And I watch and I think, this will not bring you any closer to God. And it would not help you receive the Eucharist. But it's much easier to focus on externals. Because I think, if I do this, if I do that, no. Move to a humble, contrite heart. It's the only thing that God wants. And we'll turn to that soon because we have to move on in terms of what she's talking about in this chapter towards what she calls humility. Okay? What we're doing, this book is immense, and we're only up to about the 7th page. Okay, so there's an awful lot. Are you with me? Can you follow what I'm saying? Okay. So why? Well, the context for Saint Teresa, as I said, always is entering within yourself. And if you ask the question, how do I enter within myself? It's the same question that John of the Cross asks on the first stanza of the commentary of the spiritual canticle. The path into the place where God is what we call the path of prayer. And Saint Teresa says exactly the same thing at the beginning. I think it's in the prologue, if not, it's right at the beginning of the first chapter. The way to enter this beautiful mansion, which is your soul, to go to the place where God is prayer. That bothered me when I first heard it as a young comer. So, well, how am I going to get into myself? Okay? It's like trying to lift yourself up by your own bootstrings. How do you go in within yourself? We'll talk about prayer sometime, because if you follow what I'm going to teach you, you will eventually be able to go within yourself. Okay? And when you go within yourself, you start to have a different understanding of yourself and of others. Because the person sitting next to you is another soul in which God dwells. Okay? That's a wonderful thing. That's why the church has its teaching on life. Why it has such a strong teaching on abortion. Because the soul of the unborn is also a precious diamond in which God dwells. I don't have a particular problem with wondering what happens to those souls, because they're in God's hands. But I worry about the people involved, because it has implications for the ones because they're the ones doing something wrong. And they're the ones who, according to Saint Teresa, their soul is having more black tar put around them. Whereas as the soul of the unborn, even though not yet baptized, they're at the mercy of God. We're all at the mercy of God, whether baptized or not. And their soul is never darkened. Okay, so I never worry about. Someone said, what about all these? And I think they're in God's hands. They're in better hands than in mine. Isn't it? Don't worry. They're in God's hands, and besides, miscarriages happen every day. What about them? They're in God's hands too. You know, always have the perspective of God. Not a negative perspective, a positive perspective which looks towards God. So, where we're going is trying to enter within ourselves. So, why does sin have a hold in our lives? Why can't I enter myself? And St. Teresa goes back to her brilliant image of a mansion or a castle. And she says, outside the castle, there are snakes and toads. And let's begin by saying what the snakes and toads are in her image. They're the things which incline me to sin. Okay? And they're on the outside. And she says, like you, they can enter the front door. But the deeper you go into the castle, you'll find fewer and fewer snakes and toads and all these things. They abound on the outside. In the first section of the spiritual life, they're there. Many of them can get in the door. And what are they in experience? The things, the temptations that take me away from God. So just because you've begun the path of prayer and you've got good intentions and desires for God, the problem is you still want those toads and snakes, what they're about. You still want them, even though you've taken the first step. That's, as St. Teresa says, is simply the reality of life. And unlike some religious teachers, she knows very well why, what I'm going to say, because of her own experience. You can't kill those snakes and toads just by walking in the front door. They're there. And you will fall by those snakes and toads. You can't make a choice to follow God and in that one choice go on from there. Even St. Paul couldn't do that. Take these wounds from me. What's he talking about? He's talking about a snake or a toad in St. Teresa's language. He's talking about something, part of him, which inclines him away from God. And the only reason he would say, take that from me, is because the great St. Paul is still doing things wrong because of what these things are. Okay, and we'll come to that again because St. Teresa also understands what that is. Notice I said to you right at the beginning, real Catholic spirituality is about the real experience of life. It's not caught up in someone saying, you have to do this. When I hear someone say that, I wonder, are you able to do what you're saying? St. Teresa talks to us about the experience of sin because we are all able to sin. It's part of our life. And that's the extraordinary thing about being a Catholic. I'm not afraid of sin because I can confess my sin. As we'll see when we get to the next chapter, the next mansions, my sin teaches me about myself. My sin teaches me about my dependence on God, because without God it will be impossible not to sin. And my sin puts me into a realistic relationship with God. If when you walk in the first mansions in the front door, you say, I walked in the front door, I can never sin again. I'm perfect. Goodness me. I had someone once telephone me and said to me, Father, I think I want to be a discount Carmelite. I said, oh, tell me why. Well, I've read all the stuff in Teresa and John of the Cross and all the stuff about sin. And he said, I've got over all of that. I don't sin anymore. And I said, well, you better not come to us because we're all sinners. that bizarre sense, which is unreal. Okay? And we have to ground this in the real. So at the front door, And as we begin to enter in, we discover snakes and toads, which incline us away. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Don't be discouraged by the fact that you're not perfect. Simple truth is because you will never be perfect. You know, your bishop is a very imperfect guy. But it's important that you know you're not perfect. Okay? And one of the great things about sin is it will stop you from being proud. It's not to say that I want you to sin. It is, I've said to you previously, if you're going to sin, you better learn something from it. And the other thing, I remember I told you, if you're going to sin, enjoy it. And everyone laughs, but when you stop and think about it, I don't think I know anyone who enjoys sinning greatly. It's a very strange thing. But the ordinary human wisdom is sin gives great happiness and joy. Then don't be a Christian. Okay? Your sister will slowly enter into the joy of the Carmelite life. And she won't have the things which you have. But then she'll learn that to have joy, you don't need all these other things. It soon becomes very clear to have God and to have joy. I don't need to follow these snakes and these toads. But at the beginning, you need to go that way. Okay? I'll pause to see if you've got any questions before I move on. Any thoughts or questions? Does that make any sense? Have you finished your dinner down there in Ballina? Because up here in Lismore, no one gives the bishop anything to eat. Any thoughts or questions? Does that make any sense?
It's I've definitely had like saints talk before about how sin humbles us, but I haven't understood that till now until you explained about relationship to our own pride and dependence on God.
Okay, that was a very good thing to say to me because it's pointed out to me what I will say before we finish tonight. Because there are many things at this point in this second chapter of the First Mansions. And when I come back to it, next time I will skirt over and move on to other things so I can get to the second Mansions. Because it's only got one chapter, but I think you will find the second Mansions very relevant and very helpful. Because it in fact is about the real experience of the struggle to follow Jesus. Okay. You know, all these people talk about what you need to do and what you do this and how wonderful it is. I remember going to a vocations thing and there was a nun who said, "Oh, it's wonderful. I'm so happy." And talk about how great it was to be a religious, how perfect. And I'm thinking to myself, are you talking about religious life? What are you talking about? That's not real. Because real life is about struggle. Okay, the last thing I want to talk to you about is what St. Teresa now begins to propose in this chapter for the first time. And it becomes something which is important all the way through to the very end. And it's what she calls humility. We began to speak about humility even though she doesn't refer to it as that, at the end of the first chapter of the First Mansions, when she describes prayer as knowing who you are, knowing who you're talking to, and knowing what you're saying. Now that knowing is not an intellectual knowing. Because intellectually, the mind cannot understand God in this life. And it will not understand God in the next life. That's why we speak about heaven as being vision. You will see God, Son of the Cross says, and your will, that means your choosing, will be united with God. But would you understand God? No. Because your mind's not big enough to understand God. You don't have the capacity. Do you understand nuclear physics? No, because for most of us, our minds aren't big enough. Well, if you can't understand that, how is your mind capable of understanding God? So when she says you must know who you are and know who God is, she's not saying you must understand. And yet there is a sense of understanding there, but it's not what a scientist would say. Okay. In German, the no is kennen, which is different to das. I'm trying to think of what it is in Immanuel Kant. Das reine Vernunft. The Germans have very different words for understanding and knowledge because each one is slightly different. We have to qualify our words because we're not as scientific as in our English language as the German language is. There's a certain precision in certain things, just as I'm told in Eskimos, they've got about 15 ways of talking about snow because there are about at least 15 different kinds of snow. And most of us, it's snow and it's cold. And that's the end of the story. But not for the Eskimo and for the German, not for knowledge and understanding. Okay, what does she mean by you must know yourself and know God? First of all, the knowledge of self comes from experience of self. Okay. The knowledge of God comes within the context of a contrast between who you are and who God is. Okay. And that opens you to an experience of God, but it begins in the early stage of the spiritual life as I have an experience, and through that I can ponder it and think about it, so I can move to an understanding. I have an experience and understanding of myself, which leads to the possibility of a knowledge of God, because contrast. And again, as we're going to look in the next chapter, we learn by the contrast between goodness and wrong, between light and dark. That kind of image is what she uses at the beginning of the thing to talk about sin. It's like something dark over something light, okay? And that thing which we find happening in so many writers of the spiritual life, in fact, is what Saint Teresa uses as she begins to speak about humility. My experience of myself begins to show me who God is. What's my experience of myself? Someone that is out there with the toads and the snakes. How does that begin to show me my experience of God? Because I might experience the forgiveness of God. I might experience the acceptance of God, the love of God. And those things I only experience as contrasting experiences with my experience of myself. And that's the beginning of what she speaks of as humility. As I begin to know myself, I will begin to know God. And the more that I know about God, the more that I will know about myself. Okay, now this thing called humility is something which we're just beginning to talk about. It becomes a massive component of what Teresa talks about further on. Okay, the first time that it becomes really big is in the third mansions, and we're only in the first mansions. And it continues to have a stronger and stronger place in her writings and her thinking. So at this point, we might stop here because I've been babbling for 50 minutes. So I wonder you haven't, poor old John, he wants to go to sleep, but I'm looking at him so he doesn't dare. And it looks like Brendan's vanished. He's probably finished his chips, so he's gone. Oh, he's coming in. He's been in the toilet for a long time. Okay, so this thing which we're beginning to look at, remind me, we must continue with humility. But I think to go further with it, in fact, will mean I've given you too much this evening. Go home and read the text and try to speak to each other about what the bishop taught you. Because only then do you get clarity. Only then would you begin to understand it. Father Joy, it's the only way to do exams and to write essays. Father Joy is doing some study at the moment. And it's to just read something without repeating to yourself what you've learned. You will have learned nothing. Okay. Okay, any thoughts or questions? The Scouts Carmelites fix everything up with matchsticks, rubber bands, sticky tape, and blue tack. Any questions? Did that make sense?
Bishop, I was just thinking about when you said humility is like knowing thyself, begin to know thyself. And it's also about when you know thyself, you also know God. And when you know God, you also know yourself. It was sounding to me like what Socrates was saying, know thyself.
Yes, but I'm not sure what Socrates' understanding of God was. It's very hard looking at Greek philosophy to identify what's purely Socrates, because we have Socrates through Plato. And he still refers to Socrates in his late dialogues, and it's very clear that's Plato, not Socrates. So in the early dialogues, at least up to the Phaedo, we probably have something of Socrates. And what's the difference is have a sense of the gods. But for Saint Teresa, the contrast experience is what's important. And Socrates has that in the Phaedo when he compares opposites. And that's what Jesus has also, and it's quite Platonic in the Gospels. Two opposites can't exist together. That's a big thing in the Phaedo. Hot and cold can't exist together. Odd and even can't exist together, and so on. And it's an attempt to get to somewhere through contrast. But with Socrates, I don't know that it's a contrast with God. It's not pointing to and not emerging from an experience of God as a contrast to the experience of myself. I speak of it as contrast at the moment because as we move on in Saint Teresa, we can move to the point where it's an immediate experience of God. Okay? So the experience of God that Jesus speaks of so often in the Gospels is the experience of forgiveness. And as the Jews said to him, but who alone can sin but God alone? Who alone can forgive? Only God can. And Jesus doesn't deny that. You need to remember that. Because it means in some respect we can't forgive because we're not God. Okay? And that's all about, I think, an incorrect teaching about forgiveness. The
Bishop,
teaching of forgiveness, which is not caught up in an experience of God, can't be forgiveness. Yes, John.
Bishop, like, I don't know if I picked it up right when you said that, like, we're incapable of not to sin.
What's that?
We are incapable of not sinning, not to sin.
Yeah, that comes straight from St. Augustine, you know.
Yeah, but I was just thinking, why would Jesus say to the lady who was caught in adultery, go and sin no more?
Yeah, and he would say the same to me. But as I keep sinning, I soon start to realize that I can't not sin without God. So we listen to the command not to sin as if I can do it myself. That's fine, he lets me do that. Until I realize I can't not on my own. And then that's the contrast experience. As I experience myself as someone who's struggling, I begin to recognize, as Saint Teresa recognized, I can't without you. And that's why you let me sin. Remember, when we get to the second mansion, it's a powerful statement. You can only sin because God lets you. Whatever you do, God lets you do it. God's all powerful. And why does God let me sin? For me to learn my inability and my need and dependence upon God. And for St. Augustine, that's the fundamental human truth in the writings of St. Augustine. The absolute dependence of the human being on the living God. And until we grow in that experience and live that, we're miles away from God. So why I keep saying to people, especially young people, don't think that by doing things, you'll get to heaven. It's walking this inner journey. It's the only way, because walking the inner journey will get to the point where you say, I can't, Lord, I need your help. And until you get to that point, you're living a lie, in spite of what many religious traditions say. It's not the Catholic, not the Orthodox one that includes the Russian, Greek, all these Orthodox churches. It's something which was recognized when the church declared Pelagius a heretic. Because Pelagius said, you can do it yourself. And St. Augustine, because of his experience of the inability not to sin, spoke and said, no, that's false. You can't not sin except with the grace of God. And he goes on even further, so you can't do something good and pleasing to God without God being involved in it too. Because in the end, only God can please God. And that's why Teresa says, God dwells within you. So your good works are good works if they're also God's works. Anyone else? I have to go home and cook. It's a pity I don't have a cook.
Can I ask a question, Bishop?
Yes.
It was just about you just earlier, brought up a question for me. I was reading, I might butcher the name of this, Dignitas Infinito or something, sound right? Okay. In section 12, it says, I'll try and get it exactly right. It was, for Jesus, good deeds, regardless of race or religion, is the single criterion for judgment. And I was just a bit confused, especially with what you said just a bit earlier about that.
Because good deeds emanate from God. Hitler did lots of good deeds in order to hide what he was doing. Those good deeds didn't proceed from God. So if your good deeds proceed from God, and finally from a pure heart, then they alone are the things pleasing to God. It connects a bit with what the Protestants say, we're saved by faith alone. But we Catholics say faith alone, no, because faith needs to be expressed through love. And that's what we mean, what Pope Francis means by good deed. Okay, well, I'm going to cook my dinner now. I've already beaten up an egg that I'm going to scramble, so it's waiting to be cooked. There's a lovely egg at home sitting there waiting to have its life fulfilled. And with the crooks of the nieces,
What you're having?
I'm going to have some toast as well. Glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit. Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Now, before I go, Sister D, what are you having for dinner tonight?
Isn't it not, Bishop? It is my brother who will do the cooking.
And so you're probably going to have adobo and pancit and all these nice things. Father Joy, what are you having for dinner? Because they have nice things too. They've got 3 cooks in the house.
Bishop, we have got rice. Father Joe has cooked beef, and Father Peter has cooked fish curry. Not salmon, other fish. I don't know the name of the fish. I forgot.
You're so lucky I can't afford fish.
Come and stay with us.
I should come down, but it's too far to come down just for dinner. Okay, I'll see you all at the next meeting.